So what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be touching again on the transition from the initial 7 different theories of the assassination, the kind of thoroughly, internally consistent theories that we've presented so far in the course. And we're going to be opening on to today the 8th and final theory of the octave of beliefs. I touched upon it briefly last Tuesday before Thanksgiving. For those of you who were here, we recorded that for the rest of you in the class, but you can see that up on e-commons now. But I want to just briefly touch on this, that as you know, that we opened with the theory of the Lone Gunman. This was the theory that was set forth by the Dallas Police Department immediately within hours of the assassination, confirmed by the FBI within 2 days, and insisted upon throughout the entire duration of the Warren Commission. So that we have here the Dallas Police Department, the FBI, the Warren Commission, and later on, virtually all of the mainstream media, basically, which you saw thoroughly set forth in the last 2 weeks by all the mainstream media during the 50th anniversary of the death of President Kennedy. Just saying that it was a deranged lone gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald. He was disgruntled, upset, confused, couldn't tell whether he really was an American or not, went to Russia, was upset at his wife, beat his wife. Actually, he was so bad. And so deranged. And that this is the theory of the lone gunman, which to this day remains the primary theme that is asserted by virtually all of the media in the country. Now, except for when you get outside of the borders of the United States, in which basically nobody believes it. But it turns out that approximately 80% of our people don't believe it either. But this still is the main line that is put forth by the major media. It is still considered to be the official government position. But it was just a commission. It was actually an ad hoc commission that was put together by Lyndon Johnson within days of the assassination. And it's been made perfectly clear that they were instructed from the very beginning to come out with the result that it was a lone gunman, deranged. Now that's the very first theory that we covered and we talked about it. And we found ourselves to be surprised, I think, by the amount of evidence that was actually tendered to support this particular theory. In light of the fact that some 80% of the American public don't believe it, it was really quite surprising, I think, for many to discover that the FBI asserts that it in fact was able to match the ballistic markings on 2 fragments, bullet fragments that were found in the front seat of the president's limousine after the assassination. They were able to ballistically track those particular fragments to the rifle that was owned by Lee Harvey Oswald. That they were able to track it for him having purchased it, and then they were able to, they purported to be able to, not only that, but they could in fact then run neutron activation tests that Dr. Gwynn ran to show that the actual elements and components of the mixture of metals that were in those fragments that were found in the front seat matched the fragments that were found in the brain of President Kennedy. And then they also asserted that they were able to match the fragments that were metal fragments that were taken from the right wrist of Governor Connolly, and were able to match those to the magic bullet that actually was found lying on a gurney, allegedly, in the Parkland Hospital. And so that they were able to match the ballistics from the firing pin of the Mannlicher Carcano to the 3 empty shells, expended shells that were found beneath the window. Come on in, Wes. Then they had the writing experts testifying about the handwriting that was on the order form for the Mannlicher Carcano. They had photographs of, a photograph of Lee Harvey Oswald standing in the backyard of his previous home with the Mannlicher Carcano and with the .38 on his hip. And they traced also to the .38 that he had that was taken from him, according to the police officers who arrested him in the theater within 2 hours of the assassination of the president. The .38 was matched through its firing pin marks on the 4 spent shells that were found right at the scene of the death of Tippit. Okay, and they were the same brand. Of a bullet, and the hammer marks that were the firing pin marks that were on the shell casings. This is an extraordinary amount of evidence. One might even say an excessive amount of evidence pointing to a particular person having done the killing. But what we remembered is that even though it took a full year to have the Warren Commission come out with its report in late 1964, following the November 1963 killing, that within 18 months of the actual release of the 26 volumes of documents that were supposedly supporting the conclusions of the Warren Commission, that within 18 months of the release of those 26 volumes, you started getting books like Rush to Judgment by Mark Lane and others that began to show that the actual information that was in the 26 volumes didn't really support the conclusions that were set forth publicly and allowed to lay out there in front of the public for the better part of a year, so that all the major media jumped on those things and started repeating them. And so you started to get a major question about this, but all during that period of time, there was a campaign that was going on, we remember, that was trying to assert that Lee Harvey Oswald did not in fact do this alone as a simple deranged lone gunman, but that in fact he was functioning as an agent of the communists. That he was either functioning as an agent of Fidel Castro, showing him handing out pro-Castro leaflets, etc., his own remarks that he was a Marxist, the fact that he had in fact gone to Russia and had attempted to renounce his citizenship. There was a major campaign going on to try to flag this particular theory, a second and alternative theory to the lone deranged gunman. There was an actual effort on the part of a number of people, Johnny Roselli and John Martino and others, to get the world to believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was indeed the killer, but he did it as a conscious agent and operative for the communists, so that they could gin up a wave of hostility against the island of Cuba and justify a U.S. military invasion into Cuba, which the extreme right wing had been hankering for and attempting to generate for years as of that point. So there was an entire second theory, a thoroughly consistent theory that was not unsupported by evidence of some of the conduct on the part of Oswald. But then, in fact, we discovered that once the House Select Committee on Assassinations was installed, following the Watergate burglary, following the connections that were found between the Watergate burglary and the fact that an assassination team actually had been fielded to attempt to assassinate Fidel Castro, which led to the installation of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Abuse with its corollary House Committee, the Pike Committee, over in the House. What we discovered is that House Select Committee on Assassinations, reviewing all of the evidence, came to the conclusion that because of the timing of the shots, that it would have been physically impossible for Lee Harvey Oswald to have fired all 3 of the shots within the limited amount of time that occurred, because they were able to verify it, they thought, off a dictabel that had been taken from one of the police channels, the Channel 2. And they found that one of the mics on the motorcycle of one of the police officers, patrolman, was left open, and recorded the sound of the shots. So they knew exactly what the sequencing of what the shots were, and determined that it would have been impossible for anyone to have fired those shots within that period of time. And so G. Robert Blakey, who was the chief counsel for that committee, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, ended up authorizing the report, asserting that in fact there had been another gunman, and so that there was in fact a conspiracy, that over and above just D. Harvey Oswald having been firing, but in fact there was at least one other shooter in the square at the time, almost certainly off the grassy knoll. But G. Robert Blakey came to the conclusion that it was the mob that had actually authorized and authored the killing, and that they had done so in retaliation against Bobby Kennedy and John Kennedy for having mounted a major aggressive campaign against organized crime during the first 3 years of their presidency. And that because Marcello, the mob boss in New Orleans, where Lee Harvey Oswald came from, was so upset about being threatened by the Kennedy brothers with being deported, and because Trafficante was so angry at having his heroin supply cut off through Cuba and the shutting down of the casinos, that they had basically retaliated, and they used the gunman who had been trained to assassinate Fidel Castro in this peculiar dance that we laid out in some detail, which Trafficante, as you recall, recounted to us as his lawyers back in 1972, right after the Watergate burglary. So we now, as of 1979, with the release of the House Select Committee on Assassinations report, followed up soon thereafter by a book written by G. Robert Blakey and co-authored by Dick Billings, who was the chief staff writer for the House Select Committee, called The Plot to Kill the President. We had a third fully integrated theory of the assassination of the president, that the mob had done this using the shooter team that had been trained to kill Castro, with the wink and the nod from the Central Intelligence Agency, the killing of Castro, that is. And then what happened is that because I was privileged to be informed by Santos Trafficante through our chief investigator, working for the law firm that actually was the law firm for Santos Trafficante, he recounted in detail a theory that the S-Force, or the actual 15-man anti-Castro Cuban exile group that had been recruited and put together by Santos Trafficante with the authorization at the request of Richard Nixon to assassinate Fidel Castro, that they had done this all by themselves. That because they had the capacity to perform semi-autonomously, and because they were so furious at John and Bobby Kennedy for having betrayed them, for having promised that they would free the island of Cuba, that John Kennedy, right after the Bay of Pigs event, had gone down to Miami and appeared at the Orange Bowl and had said that he gave his solemn word that the flag of a free Cuba would fly over the island of Cuba before the end of his term. Okay? And that he betrayed them, and after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and coming on that night of October 26th of 1962, right to the very edge of a massive thermonuclear war, that President Kennedy had in fact ordered the shutting down of the 5 paramilitary bases that had been established by the CIA in Swan Island and No Name Key and the Everglades, and the 2 of them at Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana. And that because of that, when Bobby and John sent in helicopter gunships to actually burn out 2 of those paramilitary bases, one on No Name Key, the CIA liaison of which was Frank Sturgis, and the other one in the Everglades, the CIA liaison of which was E. Howard Hunt, that those men became so furious, the Cubans, the anti-Castro Cubans, became so furious that Bob and John Kennedy had actually taken up guns against them and sent in helicopter gunships and had arrested them for trying to do what they had been trained to do by the CIA, that they turned on him and killed him. And this is what Santos Trafficante related to us in the office of F. Lee Bailey in May he related it to Bad Andy Tooney in 1972, but Andy communicated it to us from Trafficante in May of 1973. So this was a completely different fourth theory that sounded very plausible given the attitude that the kind of intense attitude that the right-wing anti-Castro Miami Cubans had, the reputation they had, that you could believe that they might have done this type of thing. However, there were those that when they started getting all of this information about the existence of the S-Force having been created by Richard Nixon, put together with a wink and a nod from the CIA, etc., they came to the conclusion that the S-Force would not have functioned all by itself, would not have gone off by itself, these 15 anti-Castro Cuban exiles, and assassinated the President of the United States without fear of being caught and imprisoned. So the theory was, a fifth theory, is that they were supported by a rogue element inside the Central Intelligence Agency. This is the fifth and completely integral theory, that in fact the S-Force had gone forward supported by a rogue element within the CIA, which included Frank Sturgis, who was their liaison at No Name Key, and who was furious about that group having been burnt out by the Kennedys, and the other liaison, E. Howard Hunt, who was also furious about his camp in the Everglades having been burnt down, and David Atlee Phillips, an intense anti-communist who was the Mexico CIA station chief, and in fact had come on with the CIA to be in charge of the anti-Cuban operations. That this rogue element that had gone native, basically, within the CIA, were the ones that had gone ahead and Phillips was still operating out of Mexico City and was in fact active in, very importantly, has been most recently on November 22nd of this past week, was for the first time officially confirmed by Tony, what's his name?
Antonio Veciana, who was the head of Alpha 66.
That's right. Veciana has officially sent a note to Gaetan Fonzi's wife, Gaetan Fonzi being one of the chief investigators for the House Select Committee on Assassinations, on November 22nd of 2013. He sent a note to her officially confirming that this guy, David Atlee Phillips, was in fact Maurice Bishop, who was functioning as Tony's CIA case officer, and that Veciana asserted in the note that, asserted before, that he saw David Atlee Phillips of the CIA meeting directly with Lee Harvey Oswald just days before the assassination in Dallas. And so that this theory of the rogue element within the Central Intelligence Agency, including Frank Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt and David Atlee Phillips and probably David Sanchez Morales, this is the fifth completely integral theory that we have found out. Now, but there are those that are less trusting of the CIA as an institution, who in fact have maintained, many of the researchers in the field have come to the operating conclusion that the CIA as an institution actually killed the president. Working closely with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Joint Special Operations Agency, now the Joint Special Operations Command, of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These were the special operation people. They're called the Secret Team by Fletcher Prouty. L. Fletcher Prouty was a colonel in the United States Air Force. He was responsible for the liaison between the CIA and the military in the Pentagon. So whenever military forces were needed to support a covert operation on the part of the CIA, this operation, the JSOA, the Joint Special Operations Agency, the Joint Chiefs of Staff would work directly with them. And that the researchers have come to the operating conclusion that in fact the leadership, the formal leadership itself of the Central Intelligence Agency, all of the Bill Harvey, James Angleton, Bissell, all kinds of the main leaders of the Central Intelligence Agency who had become dedicated to trying to overthrow the island of Cuba, and were dedicated to trying to oppose any advances made by the Russians, that they had actually joined together formally and had, as an institution of the secret team of the Joint Special Operations Agency and the CIA Operations Directorate, had formed an official alliance and killed the President of the United States because, as we mentioned before, because they viewed him to be a traitor, because he was actually reaching out to Nikita Khrushchev and was engaged in the exchange of some 18 letters secretly outside of the proper channels, working toward disassembling the entire nuclear arsenal of the United States, the backbone of our military strategic defense. And that he had reached out also to a back channel to Fidel Castro to attempt to, quote, normalize relations with him, and therefore cease and desist from any efforts to unhook the right-wing, or excuse me, the so-called communist government in Cuba. So that as an institution, as loyal Americans in their own point of view had found it necessary to kill Kennedy because he was engaged in this covert operation as a traitor to try to betray all of the efforts that had gone in for years to establish the United States as a major military power, able to offset and negate the ambitions, worldwide territorial and ideological ambitions of the Soviet Union. Now this is the major operating thesis within the JFK assassination research community for the most part. But there arose a lone voice within this community, a man by the name of Peter Dale Scott, who is a professor at Berkeley, as you might guess, who in fact has done massive research on this and is an extraordinary researcher. And what he determined is, he said, look, based on everything that people can reasonably find out about this, is that no one of these groups, nor even two of them working together, the Joint Special Operations Agency and the Operations Director of the CIA, none of them would have in fact been able to do this, or would have dared to do this, without authorization from above. That somebody above them or upstairs had to give the green light to allow this assassination to have taken place. This was so completely disruptive and so completely outside of the perimeters of accepted conduct, even within this world, that this could not have happened unless some higher authority had given the authorization for this to take place. And it's an extraordinarily interesting book, which you should get and read even after the course is over, and when you have summer vacation. You sit down and take a look at this. It's called Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. And he goes on at some length pointing out why it is that the constriction of your theory of what it is that happened to the president, constricting your theory to some kind of institution, whether it's the mob, or whether it's the S-Force, or whether it's the CIA, or a rogue element of it, constricting yourself to some kind of analysis of the organs of government, even the covert organs of government, that are taught in your civics class in high school or college at university level, for you to constrict your analysis of the assassination to those kind of public institutions is completely erroneous. Because he's saying that based on his 50 years of research in this field, that it's perfectly obvious to him that those institutions are not the ones that really make the decisions in the United States. That there is some higher power, there is some more powerful group behind the scenes that actually is responsible for okaying anything of this scale. And what he then points out that that's his strategic judgment, And so that he undertakes the tactical derivative conduct from his strategic observation to trying to determine who that group is. And pursuant to that tactical decision, he's come to the logistical conclusion that that higher force, that group that had to be accommodated, that called for the killing of the president, was in fact what he refers to as the intelligence community sanctioned international narcotics trafficking network. Now that's a big phrase, but what it basically comes down to is what he's asserting is that he has discovered through 50 years of research that there's a phenomenon that has occurred, that from the time that the British Empire chose to utilize opium as a mechanism for clandestine activities in the world, that the American intelligence community has seized upon this particular tactic and has been engaged at least since 1945, at the end of World War II, has been engaged in a deep alliance with international narcotics traffickers, and that they have used both the income from international narcotics trafficking and the actual personnel of the international narcotics trafficking world to serve as resources for the covert operations of our intelligence community. And he goes into specific detail about this, pointing out that at the end of World War II, the OSS, before it was disbanded, established a base in Southeast Asia, in the Golden Triangle, the first station chief of which was General John K. Singlaub, and that they functioned as a facilitator for the opium trafficking in the Golden Triangle, and that opium would be transported out of the Golden Triangle through the Corsican Mafia and transformed into heroin and shipped into Cuba, in Havana. And that, in fact, there was a full-scale Central Intelligence Agency operation functioning under the leadership of a man by the name of Paul Helliwell. And they established a company in Havana that was called the Sea Supply Corporation. That is capital S period, E period, A period. The Southeast Asian Supply Corporation. And that what they did is they handled the trafficking of the heroin into Cuba, working with Santos Trafficante and his business partner, who was Batista, who was the dictator of Cuba. And that this partnership was functioning to bring in heroin and distribute it into the United States, and a portion of the profits were being then transferred to the Sea Supply Corporation that would in fact use the money to purchase military equipment and ammunition, arms and ammunition, explosives, etc., and that they were being secretly smuggled to the Kuomintang, that is the nationalist Chinese, the post-World War II nationalist Chinese in China, who were on Taiwan and who were opposing the control of China by the communist Chinese under Mao Zedong. And so that this covert operation, which Peter Dale Scott discovered, he found to becoming more and more and more powerful in the years immediately after World War II. And he in fact tracked it back to an agreement that was made back in 1943 that was made at Comstock Prison, the Great Meadows Prison in northern New York State, that was made between the American government through Tom Dewey, who was the Republican nominee in waiting at that point, the Republican nominee for the presidency, and he, as the former governor, as the governor of New York at the time, sent an emissary, a fellow by the name of Judge Murray Dirtfire. He was a special assistant district attorney in New York, sent him to Great Meadows Prison in Comstock, New York, and conducted a series of negotiations pursuant to which Lucky Luciano, who'd been prosecuted by Tom Dewey when Dewey was the DA down in New York City, agreed to release Lucky Luciano from prison and have him go back to Sicily and to establish an agreement with the Mafia, with La Cosa Nostra, to have them do three things. Number one, they would serve as scouts for the United States military, Fifth Army, when they came in out of North Africa and invaded into Sicily at Salerno in November of 1943. That this entire operation was organized by Tom Dewey, working with the American intelligence community, with Lucky Luciano, to get them to be scouts. And there was actually a very interesting event where General Patton actually hand-delivered a yellow scarf with the symbol of the Mafia family to the head of the family in Sicily, and got them as a demonstration of the agreement that had been made with Lucky Luciano. And that pursuant to that agreement, the La Cosa Nostra provided scouts for the Fifth Army to enable them to go all the way to Rome and attack the Italian fascists in military. Now, so that was one of the agreements they made. The second agreement was to have the mob, the Cosa Nostra, or the Mafia, to actually infiltrate the Longshoremen's Union all along the eastern coast and western coast and Gulf Coast, to infiltrate the Longshoremen's Union, to keep communists from being allowed to ascend to any positions of power in the unions, which would of course also apply to socialists and liberals and people who read more than 2 books a year. That whole attitude, the mission that was given to the Mafia to suppress those types of elements inside organized labor in the Longshoremen's Union and in the Teamsters Union. This is the account of how the Teamsters Union got infiltrated by the mob and eventually bringing to power Jimmy Hoffa. This information that Peter Dale Scott was developing led him to the conclusion that what had happened is the third thing that was being done, in addition to agreeing to be scouts for the invading forces and agreeing to infiltrate the Longshoremen's Union and Teamsters Union to keep communists out of positions of power, the agreement also entailed an agreement for the Corsican Mafia to process the opium that was being smuggled out of the Golden Triangle at the end of World War II into Corsica and into Havana to help secretly fund a mechanism by which they could secretly finance the military equipment to the Kuomintang to oppose the Chinese communists. Now, this led Peter Dale Scott to conclude that there had been an accommodation, as he refers to it, made. An accommodation made by the public structures of our American government, both our political parties, our legislature, our executive branch, and even the judicial branch have been fundamentally compromised by this agreement with organized crime. And that this is the group, this intelligence-sanctioned international narcotics trafficking network, are the ones who basically called for the killing of the president. That the president, in all the things that he was doing, because you need to understand that all of those activities that the Mafia was engaged in, they were convincing themselves that they were doing it in liaison with the United States government and with the intelligence community. And so therefore, these were acts of patriotism. And they're sharing the proceeds from their heroin trafficking with the intelligence communities, and allowing their planes and boats and other things to be used as vehicles for the moving of covert operations around the world. And that what Peter Dale Scott concludes is that when you look at the deep politics of the United States since World War II, his candidate for who this more powerful behind-the-scenes group upstairs was this network. this intelligence-narcotics smuggling network. Now, I, in fact, believe that Peter Dale Scott did not go deep enough. I believe that Peter Dale Scott hit upon this particular group of people because they were so completely populating all of these different groups, right where he could see them. That my analysis of it is this, is that if in fact you accept the strategic analysis of Peter Dale Scott, that in fact there had to be some sort of force above these people that would have in fact authorized them or instructed them to go forward with their desires to kill the president. That if you come to that strategic conclusion and you accept the appropriateness of the tactical asking of the question, who would that be upstairs? That I believe that just logistically he's come up short in his analysis as to who they were. And what I want to do today and Thursday is I want to lay out for you what, in my opinion, the answer to the question is. Okay? And so that what I'll do is, because I'll know that you'll just be aching to get the answer to this until I pop it to you. What I want to do is I want to tell you what the answer is and then explain it to you. Okay? The answer to this is that much to your surprise, Lee Harvey Oswald was one of the gunmen. And that Lee Harvey Oswald was part of them. Lee Harvey Oswald, in fact, was not just some kind of a lone nut, nor was he, in fact, a Marxist or a communist or a Flaco or, in fact, deranged. What he was a young man who, when he went into the United States Marine Corps and was stationed in Japan at the U-2 base, was in fact approached by some women of the evening at these nightclubs where some of the personnel from the U-2 base frequented, and was approached and solicited for information. And he reported this to his superiors, and he was in fact then brought into a secret project that was codenamed Operation Redskin, that was run out of North Carolina by the Office of Naval Intelligence, remembering that the Marine Corps is under the auspices of the United States Navy. And he was recruited as a member of this covert operation called Operation Redskin, and was trained in the Russian language, and was then trained to become what they call in the intelligence community a dangle. And he was dangled before these women of the evening in Japan, and participated in giving them information, some of which was correct, some of which wasn't correct, as an attempt to figure out what the structure was for the information when it was given over by them, to try to track what the espionage system was that the Soviets had, attempting to ascertain information about the U-2 program. And when he was engaged in that, he began to be somewhat more ambitious, and in fact became qualified within Operation Redskin to actually be infiltrated into Russia, to become a dangle in Russia because of his knowledge about the U-2 program. And so what he did is he was sent to the Monterey Language School and learned Russian, and in fact was just announced that he had decided that his mother needed him back home, and so he would just write a letter to the Marine Corps and say, "Oh, I don't like this, I think I'd like to leave the Marine Corps." At which point they said, "Gee, okay, that'd be okay." And he did. And then he went back home to New Orleans, and within a matter of days had gone to Russia. He had $208 in his bank account and ended up with a $1,500 ticket to go to the Soviet Union. And goes there and announces that he wants to renounce his citizenship. And he ends up spending about 18 months there trying to figure out how he could get his way wangled into positions where he can be perceived by the Soviets as a spy against the United States. But this doesn't work very successfully. And so he ends up saying, on second thought, I'd like to go back to the United States. And he writes to the United States Embassy and says, I'd like to have a visa and a passport. And they say, sure, come on in and get it. And so they give it to him. And he said, oh, by the way, I'd like to have my Russian wife who's the daughter of a Russian brigadier general, come with me. And they said, sure, why not? You know, the United States is an easygoing outfit. So they end up coming back to the United States. And when they land, they're not approached by the FBI. They're not debriefed by the FBI. He's not arrested. He's not charged with anything. He, in fact, is met at the ship by a person who is the general secretary, as it turns out, for a group that was an extreme right-wing group called the American Citizens. Let me see here. I'll get the exact name of this interesting outfit for you. He was picked up by this fellow who was the general secretary for the group that was called. Who cares? What it was called, right? Anyway, it's the American Citizens. American Citizens Against Communism. So this right-wing guy ends up bringing him to a bunch of other right-wing people who are all white Russians, who are Tsarist Russians, who opposed the Bolsheviks all the way back in 1917 and had fled from Russia. And there was an entire group of these people, of U.S. citizens now that had come from Russia that were right-wing anti-communists. And he began to work with these people. And it turns out this becomes critical because Oswald ends up, in fact, being recruited as a former member of Operation Redskin, ends up being recruited by a purely private security company. This is a vital point that happens here, because what I want to tell you about is the existence of a group that you don't know anything about, and you won't have heard anything about it. You can read basically all of the literature about the assassination, from who struck John and how many shots were there and what were the angles and what was the weight of the magic bullet and how many fragments were present or not present from the bullet. But the fact is, you won't hear about this group. This is an ultra right-wing organization that was created in Dallas, Texas, by a man by the name of Charles Willoughby. And Charles Willoughby, his real name is Adolf A. Wiedenbach, who in fact is a Nazi, is a Nazi German. And he in fact was the chief of intelligence for General Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific Theater. And when MacArthur was fired by President Truman in 1951, as a result of in the Korean War, General MacArthur, as you know, was the Allied commander in Korea, and MacArthur wasn't about to tolerate having the Chinese come sweeping into Korea and beat up on American military people and get away with it. And so what he wanted to do is he wanted to nuke them, which was dear to the heart of Curtis LeMay as the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. But he wanted to use a nuclear bomb to push the Chinese, to bomb them with a nuclear weapon, and build a wall of radiation north of Korea to keep the Chinese from coming into Korea. And he was insisting upon doing this, and Truman kept explaining to him this was a bad idea, and that, oh, by the way, Truman was in charge, not MacArthur, which didn't go well with MacArthur. And his chief of intelligence, General Willoughby, was his little Scotch burr. He called him my own personal fascist, Willoughby. And what we discovered upon doing a deeper analysis of this, accepting Peter Dale Scott's strategic observation that there had to be somebody higher up behind the scenes or upstairs, and that the question was who these people were, and to try to ascertain what role they might have played in the assassination, it becomes extremely important because Willoughby is a very important man, as it turns out, because As it turns out, in 1945, when the United States drops the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, and the Japanese surrender, Truman disbanded the OSS, the Office of Special Services, that had been created at the beginning of the war, that was this unique type of paramilitary covert operations, a highly intelligent, sophisticated kind of espionage intelligence operation. He disbanded it virtually immediately after the Japanese surrendered. And he dispersed the members of the OSS around the world. And one of these people, Edward G. Lansdale, was a major in the United States Army in the OSS. He was transferred to Manila in the Philippines. And remember now, General MacArthur was the commander of all U.S. forces in the Pacific. So technically, MacArthur was the commanding officer now for Lansdale. What happened is that Lansdale, when he became the head of G2, or military intelligence in Manila in September of 1945, what he discovered is that a Japanese general who had been taken into custody, General Yakashima, had been for many years, since 1932, all the way to 1932, all the way to 1941, he had run an operation, a Japanese unit of the Japanese military called the Golden Lily Squadron. And what he had done is he had gone throughout Asia, from 1932 all the way to basically 1940, raiding and stealing and pilfering gold and silver and platinum and diamonds and rubies and anything of value that his squadron could get their hands on, and they were commandeering it. In fact, when they took over Singapore, they captured all the gold reserve that was in the Bank of England there in Singapore. And they stole big, gigantic golden Buddhas that weighed like 3 tons and stole them. And they shipped them all to Japan. And what happened is, after the Battle of Midway in June of 1943, in which the Japanese Navy, 1942, when in June of 1942, when the Japanese Navy was basically destroyed by our 6th Fleet, and followed soon thereafter in February of 1943 with the defeat of the 5th Army of Germany in front of the gates of Stalingrad, the Japanese High Command, the Imperial High Command, realized that the likelihood was that they were going to lose the war. And they began taking steps, just as the Germans did, to try to figure out how to salvage whatever they could, given the fact that they were going to lose the war. And what Japan started doing is moving the gold and silver and platinum and jewels that had been pilfered by the Golden Lily Squadron that had been stored in Japan. They began to move them out secretly to the Philippines. And they began to bury them in the Philippines. And they buried 175 separate treasure troves in the Philippine Islands. It turns out that when this young major, Edward G. Lansdale, was assigned to G2, he was there in the Philippines when General Yakashima surrendered. And knowing that he wasn't going to be able to get General Yakashima to tell him where these troves were, he hit upon the idea of torturing the admiral's driver, which they did. And he assigned this particular task to a man by the name of Santa Romano, a young Philippine military officer who was personally in charge of the torturing. And Edward Lansdale participated in overseeing the torturing of this driver, trying to extract from him information about where one or more of these treasure troves might be. And in fact, they succeeded in December of 1945. And Santa Romano reported to Lansdale that he had found one of these troves, and Lansdale and Santa Romano, with the captured and tortured driver, went to the site and ended up finding out how to get through the booby traps at the site with the assistance of the driver who had seen them installed. And they struck into this trove, and they discovered that this trove had $100 billion worth of gold and silver and platinum. And it turns out that every one of these 176 troves had $100 billion in gold, in platinum, in silver, in jewels that had been hidden in the islands. And so what happened is they had him show them 12 of these things to prove that there were more of them, and that they discovered 12 of these particular troves, actually punched through one of them to confirm that it had $100 billion worth of treasure in it. And you remember, now this is gold at $32 an ounce.
That's what I'm thinking.
It's now about $1,400 an ounce. But what they discovered this $100 billion worth of treasure. And what happened is this young, enterprising young major, G2, former OSS officer, mounted up and flew to Singapore. Ed Lansdale went directly to Singapore to meet with General MacArthur to tell him about the discovery, that they had now discovered $1.2 trillion worth of gold and silver and platinum and jewels in these 12 troves. And he began to explain this to face to MacArthur. MacArthur brought into the meeting with him his G2, who was Charles Willoughby,
Oh my.
aka Adolf Wiedenbach. And they came in, and what MacArthur did is said, look, this is so extraordinary, I'm going to have you fly in my personal plane back to Manila, back to Hawaii, back to Washington State, back to Omaha, back into Washington, D.C., and I want you to meet directly with Harry Truman, President Truman, and tell him what we've got here. And what they did is in December 1945, they flew back into Washington, D.C., and they tried to get a meeting with Truman face to face. Truman insisted that his chief of staff be briefed about what this was all about, and that man was Clark Clifford. And Clark Clifford was briefed by Ed Lansdale and Willoughby as to what they had discovered. He brought them into the meeting with Truman, and they began to discuss this with Truman. Truman was so shocked by this that he sent for his Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, and brought him into the meeting. And Henry Stimson, when he started learning what they had discovered, he in fact brought in two of his deputies. His Assistant Secretary of War, whose name was Robert Lovett, and his Deputy Assistant Secretary of War, who was John J. McCloy, and his Deputy Assistant Secretary of War, who was Robert B. Anderson. And they all said in the meeting, and it turns out that what they had in common, Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, and in fact Robert Lovett, and Robert B. Anderson, is that they were all senior partners in a firm known as Brown Brothers Harriman. Brown Brothers Harriman was a private investment house that had existed since 1818, that they had become a dominant force in the financial world by figuring out that they could take advantage of this new form of corporation that was created in 1868. A corporation where wealthy financial investors could purchase the stock of a given company, and then the company could do basically anything that it wanted to do, and the owners of the stock were immune against any liability. And the management of the corporation was immune personally against any liability. That the only thing that was liable would be the assets that were contained within the corporation. And this was developed around 1868, and Brown Brothers Harriman realized that it had discovered two things: a way in which their private financial investors, who as time passed became people like John D. Rockefeller, who in fact owned the Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of California, also J.P. Morgan, the J.P. Morgan Guarantee Trust. The Rockefellers also owning the Chase Manhattan Bank. and E.H. Harriman. E.H. Harriman owning many of the rail lines and steel mills and others. That this group of private financiers came together in this investment house called Brown Brothers at that time. And it turns out that they eventually joined forces with E.H. Harriman Company and formed Brown Brothers Harriman. And it turns out that these are the group of people that owned and represented things such as the United Fruit Company. And the United Fruit Corporation was very active, as you know, in Latin America, in South America. And what happened is this private investment group, Brown Brothers Harriman, the CEO of this group eventually came to be George Herbert Walker. And George Herbert Walker, the CEO of this particular operation, with John D. Rockefeller in it, and then David Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan, and E.H. Harriman, and then Averill Harriman, and this whole group of people, that they had devised a mechanism through their being represented by a particular law firm in New York by the name of Sullivan and Cromwell. And it turns out that Cromwell, of the Sullivan and Cromwell, had in fact been the man inside the United States State Department that was primarily responsible for seizing, getting control over Panama, and then the later building of the Panama Canal, and overthrowing the elected governments down there. This Brown Brothers Harriman became this coven of high financiers who had decided, through their being represented by Sullivan and Cromwell, this powerful guy Cromwell and this other guy Sullivan, who had all been intimately involved back during the robber baron era of America. That went from basically 1868 to 1898, this 30-year period. This is an extraordinarily important period in American history, because now, for those of us here, you think 30 years, that's longer than you guys have been alive. But the fact of the matter is, that was basically back when Ronald Reagan became president, and you've all heard about him. So that this was not that long ago. That period of 30 years isn't that long a period. But between 1868 and 1898 in the United States, there was this huge operation going on that had started earlier as Manifest Destiny. This whole operation of sweeping across the Appalachians into Indian territory and vanquishing the Indians and pushing our way all the way to the coast. It went on from 1845 to 1849 with the big gold rush and taking over the Indian territory and the Dawes Act that they established in 1889. This entire period was one of major imperial expansion that was going on. And it was these financiers, the robber barons, who owned the rail companies, who owned the oil companies, who owned the feed companies, that owned the cattle companies. They owned all of these things, and they did it through this mechanism of a centralized investment house of Brown Brothers Harriman. Is they would go in and they would buy out all of these companies by purchasing the stock and taking control of these companies. And one of them was the United Fruit Corporation. And that when, in fact, the United Fruit Corporation ran into trouble, for example, down in Nicaragua in 1904, these people basically utilized their major financial power and their influence on elected representatives, United States senators and congresspeople, and presidential candidates, etc., to actually get a foreign military expeditionary force sent down into Nicaragua to overthrow the democratically elected government down in Nicaragua and install Anastasio Somoza, Sr., in power down in Nicaragua. And this particular mechanism of utilizing their extraordinary financial power that these people had, and they were, as I said, they were represented by the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. And the two senior partners that were in Sullivan and Cromwell, the lawyers who ended up representing not only Brown Brothers Harriman, but also the individual financial investors individually in their private capacity, the inside Sullivan and Cromwell, were John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. And so it starts coming circle now. Allen Dulles, as you may remember, was the man who became the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. he is the guy that was crossing swords with John Kennedy. So that this whole issue of the history of how the Central Intelligence Agency came into being is directly related to this operation, to this group of people. Because this group of people, back in 1906, that whole period following the robber baron era from 1868 to basically went to 1898 with the election of McKinley and his boss Mark Hanna. These guys, if you look in history, you'll discover that there was this period where these men, this group of a dozen men, basically owned and controlled almost everything in the United States. And that they had a series of policies where they, in their minds, for example, they employed, 5, 6, 7-year-old children, working, 18-hour days, 7 days a week in their minds. They had factories, textile factories, where they had young women that were, 15, 16, 17 years old, working 18-hour days, 6 days a week. They in fact had oil fields, railway companies, major factories where people were being injured consistently. And they had such control over the Senate and House through the financial investments that they made in basically bribing congresspeople and senators that they in fact were running rampant over the entire country. And they were engaged in a major process of imperialism. They in fact they generated a policy whereby they not only took over all of southern Texas in 1845, but they ended up in 1893, 1894, they ended up taking over Hawaii and taking over the Philippines. They were expanding in this manner, and it turns out that the Secretary of State during a portion of that time, up to 1893, was a fellow by the name of John W. Foster, who turns out to be the grandfather of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles. He was the Secretary of State under Benjamin Harriman when we took over the Philippines and Hawaii. And what he did is in 1893, actually when Allen Dulles was born, he retired, and his son-in-law, a fellow named Robert Lansing, who married John W. Foster's older daughter, became the Secretary of State for Wilson during World War I.
Wow.
And what he did, as the uncle of John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, who were young lawyers in the firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, actually brought them with him to the Treaty of Versailles, where he, as the Secretary of State, was supervising the negotiations, and they ended up, John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, who are the lawyers now for Brown Brothers Harriman, ended up drafting up the reparations agreements, saying that Germany was going to have to pay reparations for having mounted an aggressive war in World War I. And they were going to have to pay reparations to the various companies that had lost money during this process. And it turns out that John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles drafted up the reparations agreement and were made the lawyers for Germany, which becomes very important here. Because the fact of the matter is, here's Sullivan and Cromwell, the lawyers for Brown Brothers Harriman, with John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles as partners now, representing Brown Brothers Harriman, the grandsons of John W. Foster, this major imperialist Secretary of State, and their uncle, Robert Lansing, his son-in-law now, basically coaching these two young guys. They would actually, they had a large compound, like Hyannis, that was up on one of the Great Lakes up in northern New York. And John W. Foster and Robert Lansing would take the two young boys out separately in different boats fishing, lecturing them on imperialism, on how in fact, when he was 8 years old, Allen Dulles wrote a major essay supporting the Boers in South Africa, and saying how they were getting a raw deal from the view of the world, because of these fascists that were in South Africa. And so that this whole process was going on. And that when these two young lawyers became the lawyers for Germany at the end of World War I in 1917, This was the exact point in time when the Bolsheviks revolted and overthrew the Tsar in Russia. And it turns out these same people from Brown Brothers Harriman and Sullivan and Cromwell ended up instigating and generating the creation of a foreign military expeditionary force, just like the one they had sent into Nicaragua back in 1904 under General Smedley Butler of the United States Marine Corps. They sent a foreign military expeditionary force into Russia in 1917, which you don't find out about at all. I mean, you guys could graduate with an honors degree in history from this university and others and never be told about that. Because the fact is, it's part of this back channel of what goes on in American politics. That there is this higher, deeper group that actually is calling the shots. And this foreign military expeditionary force went into the new Soviet Union and tried to kill in the cradle the Bolshevik Revolution, working together with these extremely reactionary pro-Tsarist forces known as the White Russians that lived all in western Russia around St. Petersburg. Okay? This is the group that immigrated when the revolution was successful and came to the United States after World War I. Okay? And so that we're in this period now, immediately following World War I, and what happens now is this is a period in which John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, as partners now in Brown Brothers, or in Sullivan and Cromwell, are representing Brown Brothers Harriman, the chief executive of whom is George Herbert Walker, and include people like John D. Rockefeller and now David Rockefeller, and E.H. Harriman and Averill Harriman, and J.P. Morgan. All of these guys are there. And in 1924, what they do is George Herbert Walker steps out as the CEO, turning over control to his son-in-law, Prescott Bush. Okay? This is Prescott Bush, the father of George Herbert Walker Bush, the grandson of George Herbert Walker, the CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman, who steps out of being the CEO, turning it over to Prescott Bush, and sets up, and George Herbert Walker sets up a thing called the Union Bank of New York. And these financiers begin to move a lot of their money in deposits into the Union Bank of New York. And then they, in fact, set up a subsidiary bank. This is immediately after World War I now. This is now basically by 1924. They set up a bank in the Netherlands, a branch office bank of the Union Bank of New York. It's called the Bank for Commerce and Shipping in the Netherlands, headed up by a man named Fritz Thyssen. And they put the money into this bank, they deposit their money into this bank, and the bank begins to provide loans to Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist Party that is in Germany. At the same time that the Sullivan Cromwell law firm, through John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, are representing the official government of Germany in negotiating loans which are being extended to Germany by the clients of Brown Brothers Harriman. So they're actually financing the loans that are going to Germany, and there's a back channel going on at the Union Bank of New York, these financiers depositing money in there, transferring it into the Netherlands bank, and using it to support the rise of Hitler as the bulwark against Bolshevism in Europe. Okay? This process goes on all the way to 1934, in which we find in a meeting with Adolf Hitler, Allen Dulles, sitting in a meeting with him in 1933 to decide whether or not he is going to be made the Chancellor of Germany. And as the lawyer handling all the loans to the government of Germany, Allen Dulles is the one that makes the decision as to whether or not he believes that there's an adequate commitment on the part of Adolf Hitler, if he's made Chancellor, that he'll continue paying the loans back to the clients of Brown Brothers Harriman. So this is the process that goes on, and that's why in 1936 at the Olympics you find in the box sitting there with Adolf Hitler in the 1936 Olympics, John J. McCloy, who turns out, you may recognize the name, is the guy in 1945 who ends up being brought into the meeting about this major trove of gold that they found, because John J. McClure is now the Deputy Assistant Secretary of War under Henry Stimson, a senior partner in Brown Brothers Harriman. And so what happens, what we've discovered is that there was this trove of gold that had been discovered, and that this gold in platinum and silver and jewels were all put under the control in 1945, December of 1945, of a completely private, non-governmental trust that was administered by Robert B. Anderson, John McCloy, and Robert Lovett, called the Black Eagle Trust. It's also known as the Anderson Trust of Texas. Okay, and so what happened is that you have a group of people now, as of December of 1945, who are now privately in control of $1.2 trillion, privately, who are the senior partners in Brown Brothers Harriman, which is the investment firm that is represented by Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles as their lawyers, who are also the lawyers for the German government at the exact same time. And so that this situation that obtains is in 1945, when they were at the end of the war, and what we've discovered is, you remember the interesting story that I told you about Joseph Burkholder Smith. That I ended up getting introduced to Joseph Burkholder Smith by Richard Billings, who was the chief staff writer for the House Select Committee on Assassinations. He sat me down with the guy, and the guy explained in detail about how in 1973, Theodore Shackley, who was a German-born member of the 101st Counterintelligence Corps of the United States Army in 1945, that Shackley had become the translator for Reinhard Gehlen in 1945. In September 1945, Reinhard Gehlen had basically turned himself in to the 101st Counterintelligence Corps of the United States Army and said, "I'm Reinhard Gehlen. I am the Waffen-SS Third Reich commander for all anti-Soviet and anti-Eastern Bloc intelligence throughout the entire war. And I'm turning myself into you, and I will work for you if you will take my name and the name of another 100 men that I want to designate, take them off the Nuremberg War Tribunal list, and work with me, and you make me the head of West German intelligence. Once the war is over and Germany is divided into the East and West, you make me the guy in charge of West German intelligence." And Gehlen, his translator that's given to him is Theodore Shackley. And Theodore Shackley accompanies Gehlen to Fort Hunt, just outside of Washington, D.C., shortly after he turns himself in, and they carry on a almost 3-week-long negotiation with Shackley serving as Gehlen's translator, and Gehlen succeeds in getting the United States to agree to make him the head of intelligence for the new West German government at the end of World War II. And Gehlen serves for 26 years as the chief source of anti-Soviet intelligence for the NATO nations. And his deputy, working under him, is Theodore Shackley, who goes on to become the hand-picked chief of covert operations for the American Central Intelligence Agency under George Herbert Walker Bush. Okay? So what I'm saying, we're back now at that point right in 1945, at the end of the war, where these things are going on. That we know now that Gehlen has turned himself in, has been made the head of West German intelligence after the war. And what happens is the Central Intelligence Agency does not exist yet. The OSS has been disbanded, but there's this private group under the Anderson Trust that now have $1.2 trillion at their disposal, their private disposal. And what they begin doing is they begin issuing gold certificates. These monies are moved to the International Credit Bank in Geneva, Switzerland, and they issue gold certificates. And then they give these gold certificates to former Nazis all throughout Europe for them to use to finance their elections in electoral contests against partisans who have in fact spent the entire war fighting against the fascists. Okay? And now that the fascists have been beaten, the partisans run for public office, and this secret trove of money under the Anderson Trust is used to secretly finance their fascist opponents. So that the fascists are then elected throughout Europe to take over the new governing positions in post-World War II Europe in alliance with the Americans. And what happens then is a movement begins to build in which there's pressure being put on to recreate the OSS that has been disbanded now in August by Truman. There's an amount of pressure being put on the people who want to form this alliance with the Nazis and with Galen in their anti-Soviet intelligence operations through a thing called Operation Overcast is the name of that project. They in fact begin to argue on behalf of the creation of some kind of a new force, a unit of some sort, an agency that will engage in activities that are more vicious and more effective than those that might be employed against us over and against the Soviet Union. There's this major dialectical, confrontational tone that is adopted. Truman appoints a commission called the Doolittle Commission to evaluate what steps might be taken to respond to this kind of pressure. And the chief author of the Doolittle Commission report is a guy by the name of William D. Pauley. William D. Pauley is an extreme right-wing fascist, actually, who in fact was proud of being a fascist. And he in fact was instrumental in recommending the creation of an agency that could be more ruthless and effective in destroying its enemy than the Soviet Union might be able to muster. And he actually said in the report that this may be completely repugnant to Americans because it so clearly violates their basic sense of decency and fair play. But that in fact this still has to be done whether the American people are told about it or not. And that's the Doolittle Commission report by William Pauley. Okay? And this is what generates the creation of the National Security Act of 1947, which they create the Central Intelligence Agency. And in subsection 5412, they authorize the CIA over and above its authority to gather intelligence data and evaluate the data and make recommendations from time to the President or to the new National Security Council to also, quote, engage in other assignments from time to time that have been designated by the President or the National Security Council. And they take unto themselves, under that auspices, the authority to engage in covert operations, just as though they were at war with the Soviet Union, clandestinely. And so this is the matrix of forces that are taking place now right at the very end of World War II. Okay? You get the creation of this extraordinary Anderson Trust in the hands of the senior partners of Brown Brothers Harriman, the very people who have in fact previously funded the creation of the Third Reich in Europe as the bulwark against Bolshevism in Europe. And now here these people are funding this, handling this fund, financing the election of fascists all through Europe and also in Japan. They're actually funding organized crime people that are right-wing anti-communist to take political office in Japan. And this whole operation is going down at the same time that Reinhard Gehlen decides, as the commander of anti-Soviet intelligence for the Allied nations, he decides to create a special academy in Bavaria, high in the mountains of Bavaria, in a little town called Oberammergau. He establishes an anti-communist special warfare training academy. And he puts in charge of that academy Nazi General Otto Skorzeny, the Major General who was the commander of the SS elite force called the Werewolves. that this is the guy, 6'5", you know, saber scar, 6-league boots, riding crop, the whole 9 yards. This guy is the commander of the Anti-Communist Special Warfare Training Academy, established by Reinhard Gehlen. And between 1946 and 1965, this place trains over 1,200 men from throughout the world that were high-level intelligence officers of the Allied nations. United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, including Israel, trained at this academy by Otto Skorzeny, whose wife is Ilsa Skorzeny, who happens to be the niece of the man by the name of Schacht, who was the partner of Fritz Thyssen in the bank that financed the rise of Hitler. Okay? These are the people that are training these Americans and Israelis and others in a special anti-communist warfare training academy that taught them everything of blackmail, assassinations, poisoning, you know, electronic surveillance, every imaginable dirty trick that you can imagine. And it turns out that these 1,200 men who were trained between 1946 and 1965, in fact, fanned out across the world, and in fact, as I mentioned before, were more loyal to each other horizontally than they were to their governments vertically. And this is the brotherhood. This is the brotherhood that was established by Otto Skorzeny, one of the trainees of whom was Theodore Shackley, who was in the entering class of 1947 of the Central Intelligence Agency. And Theodore Shackley was assigned by the Central Intelligence Agency. First, after graduating from the CIA from the fish farm, he was actually sent to the academy of Otto Skorzeny, and then spent the next period of time as the deputy to Reinhard Gehlen in the office in Berlin. And this Berlin operating base became extraordinarily important because in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the person who was assigned to be the governor general in Germany was John J. McCloy, the fellow that I mentioned to you, who had been the deputy secretary of war under Henry Stimson, and had been one of the people that was put in charge of the trust, of the Anderson Trust. And he is now in Germany, working directly with Reinhard Gehlen, the head of the Waffen-SS, the anti-Soviet and anti-Eastern intelligence operation of the Third Reich, and Otto Skorzeny. And Theodore Shackley is right there with John J. McCloy. And the CIA, after it's created in 1947, actually opens an office there. It's called the Berlin Operating Base. And you have there people like Bill Harvey and others who all end up eventually going to the Miami station to work against Cuba. And the person who is brought in eventually to run the CIA station in Miami is Theodore Shackley, the guy who was the right-hand man to Reinhard Gehlen and was trained under Otto Skorzeny as one of these 1,200 men who, in fact, have been taught the absolute value of fascism. Okay? And remember, this entire Third Reich is not the source of fascism. It was the creation of fascism. That the people who were the originators of the fascist idea were the people in Brown Brothers Harriman and in Sullivan and Cromwell, who actually set up the bank, the Union Bank of New York, and the Bank of Commerce and Shipping in the Netherlands to create the Third Reich. So it's not that these people were somehow recruited by Nazis, that these people were fascists, that they believed just as the robber barons believed. Most of them, their fathers and uncles and grandfathers, that they believed that there was an elite that had the right to govern. That they didn't believe at all in the fundamental premises of the American Constitution, in democracy, in egalitarianism, in fundamental rights on behalf of individuals. These people never believed in that. They always believed And basically the exact same thing that came to a kind of an ugly head in the Third Reich is that there's a Caucasian race that is superior to all of the other races. And in a classic social Darwinist dynamic, they believe that they are fundamentally in dialectical struggle with the aboriginal nomadic people of the world who are threatening constantly to infect their gene pool. And that this group of elites believe that the organs of the state should be organized to facilitate, indeed subsidize, the major corporations that have been designed by them to house their investments and preserve them immune against any liability for whatever the conduct of those corporations is. Okay? So that they've devised this entire scheme by the period of 1924. They've been engaged through that whole period from 1868 to 1898. Their fathers and grandfathers have been engaged in this major domination of the entire American political structure, seizing control of them through the corporations and buying and selling the senators and congressmen. This has been going on for that entire period. And what happened is that it was becoming so oppressive as of 1888, for the first 20-year period of this, from 1868 to 1888, that the National Board of Homeland Ministries of the United Methodist Church was so freaked out by these robber barons and what they were doing to the American economy and to the American society with child labor and these ungodly working hours and working conditions, etc., that the National Board of Homeland Ministry decided in 1888 that they were going to train all of their Sunday school teachers about the violation on the part of these robber barons of the most basic Judeo-Christian social ethical values. And so what they did is they set up a training center up at Chautauqua, New York, up in northern New York, by Buffalo, on Lake Chautauqua. They had a big resort there, and they agreed to bring all of the people that were going to be Sunday school teachers in their Methodist churches to come there for free for the summer of 1888. And they would, in fact, train them there. They could bring their families, their children, and spouses with them, and they'd be put up for free for the summer to be trained. And it turns out so many people came to that they developed an entire camp to provide for them in the summertime. And they did this from 1888 to 1890. And then they realized that that was too slow a process. By just teaching their Sunday school teachers to teach kids in Sunday schools about how vile and evil and wrong it was what the robber barons were doing, what they did is they decided to open their training school to all civics teachers in the high schools around the country. And in 1890, so many people came to Chautauqua, New York, that it was the Woodstock of the 19th century. That thousands of people came to try to get this training, and they had to put them up in tents and camps in other people's houses. They all had to chip in food. It was just like Woodstock, which is not coincidental, because it turns out that that was, in fact, the idealist generation of the 20th century. That whole group of people that were involved in the Chautauqua movement. And they generated, between 1888 and 1900, actually, they generated the American Labor Union movement, the women's suffrage movement, the anti-child labor movement, the free public education movement with Dewey. They generated the post-Civil War civil rights movement on behalf of blacks against Jim Crow laws. And they initiated the original environmental movement, actually seeking to have area preserved in the country. So the Chautauqua movement became a major operation in the United States, so that by the summer of 1914, there were over 2,000 regional Chautauquas taking place in the United States, which where people were speaking, women's suffrage movement people were speaking, labor union people were speaking, Eugene Debs and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and all of the people were speaking on tours of these Chautauquas around the country. This became the primary organizing operation against the robber barons that was taking place in the United States, all the way up until the beginning of the war. And these people, these forces in Brown Brothers Harriman, these robber barons in their law office of Sullivan and Cromwell, these people all began to organize. And in 1913, there was a meeting that was held at a place called Jekyll Island, in which they came up with this idea of creating the Federal Reserve System. That not only had they created, through the creation of corporations, a new financial instrument. Follow this. There's a corporation, say a corporation has assets that are in 1868 or 1888, has assets of $1 million. What they do is they then have 1 million shares of stock, each worth $1. And so that they own those stocks. And so if someone is to say, well, look, I see your company that it has $1 million worth of assets. I think that you're going to do really well. I think by next year you'll have $2 million worth of assets. So that $1 stock that you have, I'm willing to pay you $2 for that right now. And another person would say, well, wait a second, I think in another 4 years that's going to be worth, you're going to have assets of $4 million. I'll give you $4 for that stock right now. What they've designed is a financial instrument that actually justifies gambling, so that they can start gambling about what the value of these particular instruments are going to be. But these instruments start becoming of value in and of themselves. And this financial investment house of Brown Brothers Harriman, what they do is they go around buying up pieces of these stocks, and that they bring them into Brown Brothers Harriman. They're a financial investment house, is what they are. But they're also a center where these people meet together and make policy together. And that they come up with a decision, for example, to have the Union Bank of New York set up by George Herbert Walker, and to end up setting up a subsidiary bank in the Netherlands and funding the rise of Hitler to establish a bulwark against Bolshevism in Europe. That what we have there is a center of power in the United States that has become extraordinary. And so that what happens is that when we get all the way to the end of World War II, we discover that these people are sitting on a $1.2 trillion trove, which they're actually utilizing to fund the election of fascists all throughout the world. And they have an academy set up in Oberammergau in the Bavarian Mountains where they're training 1,200 men to fan out all across the world inside the intelligence community, where they in fact have constant dialogue with each other, which is more intense than the dialogues they have with their superiors. So that this force has been created in the world by the end of World War II. And what we discover happens now is that when General MacArthur is fired by Harry Truman in 1951, what happens is that he is invited to come back to the United States, to Dallas, Texas, by H.L. Hunt and Clint Murchison, Sr., two very wealthy people there in Texas. They invite him back in, and they hold a massive parade for him, and they set up a General MacArthur for President headquarters. Okay? Remember, now his deputy is Charles Willoughby, who in fact was central to the establishment of this trust. And it turns out that General Lansdale is part of this as well, because Lansdale is the guy that found the treasure trove. He was in the meetings, and General Lansdale, Edward Lansdale, becomes an operative for the Anderson Trust. And so that operation is functioning semi-autonomously. And what happens is when General MacArthur comes to Dallas in 1951, and General Willoughby comes with him, General Willoughby establishes a private security firm that is called the Foreign Intelligence Digest Network. And the Foreign Intelligence Digest Network is the operation that was made up of former military intelligence operatives, such as Lee Harvey Oswald, when he served in Operation Redskin. And lots of low-level former Army intelligence people and Marine Corps intelligence and Naval intelligence people are privately hired by this Foreign Intelligence Digest network. And a major corporation is set up called the World Commerce Company. The World Commerce Company is funded by H.L. Hunt, Clint Murchison, and William Pauling, among others. And there is a secret source of financing that these people seem to have that are engaged in collecting private intelligence information about American citizens whom they consider to be communist or pro-communist or too liberal. And that this whole period then begins to generate what comes to be known as the McCarthy era. That this entire period of time in the United States that everybody kind of looks back at and goes, oh, how in the world did something like that happen? What happened is there was this major operation functioning, the Foreign Intelligence Digest Network, that was going around not only investigating every single person who, as I mentioned, reads more than 2 books a year, but I mean, they were actually going to libraries and trying to find out what kind of library books people were reading. And they were preparing lists of people that were considered to be communist people. And the fact of the matter is that is who I believe employed Lee Harvey Oswald when he came back from the Soviet Union and came back into New Orleans. And he, in fact, wrote a letter to H.L. Hunt, a very famous letter, in which he said, Mr. Hunt, I would like to have some clarification as to exactly what my position is working for you. Okay? And that he, therefore, is going around still pretending that he's pro-communist, which works so well for him in Operation Redskin, and going around trying to infiltrate the anti-Castro Cuban community groups, handing out flyers and stuff. But he's doing it out of 54 Camp Street in New Orleans, which is the base of Guy Bannister, who is in fact the head of the World Anti-Communist League's Caribbean chapter. Okay, and he's dealing with extreme right-wing people like David Ferry and Clay Shaw and these other people, and people can't figure out what's going on with this guy. You know, and he's got this facade up that he was a Marxist and pro-communist and went to the Soviet Union, renounced his citizenship, was running around being pro-Castro. But in fact, he's working and seen repeatedly, bringing military equipment to Lake Pontchartrain, where one of those paramilitary bases is set up where they're actually attacking Cuba from. And that's the real character of Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald is a very specific kind of guy who, in fact, goes into these left-wing groups, progressive groups, etc., and gathers intelligence information about them and prepares reports and hands them over to other people, but not working for any government institution. Not working for the CIA, no matter what people suspect. Not working for the FBI, no matter what anybody suspects. But in fact is working for this other private organization, this Foreign Intelligence Digest network that is funded by William Pauling and in this other trove of money. And it's important to remember now that this trove of money is managed by people who are not just conservative. And they're not just businessmen. And they're not just simple financiers. These people are fascists. These people believe that the entire government ought to be dominated and controlled by a wealthy elite, usually Caucasians. And they believe in nation-state-based Caucasian capitalist imperialism. That is their mode of operating. You can look right back to the era of the robber barons, and you see exactly what they believe in. It's unvarnished. It's manifest destiny. It's the white man's burden. And this is precisely why the whole operation was being opposed by the Chautauqua movement, the religious community in the United States, all joining together, trying to create these secular labor unions and women's rights to vote and civil rights movement and environmental movement, etc., against them until 1917, at the end of World War I, when the Bolsheviks overthrow the Tsar and they establish the world communist movement. And what that does is it sucks all of the oxygen out of the Chautauqua movement. And what happens is that the communists, the Bolshevik communists, set themselves up as the antithesis to Caucasian, nation-state-based capitalist imperialism, which is the modus operandi of the elite in the West. And the fact is that elite in the West represents a long-term group inside the United States that has been there ever since the founding of the United States. That when the United States Constitution was established in 1789, there was a whole element inside the founding fathers, led by Alexander Hamilton, that in fact did not believe in the egalitarianism, did not believe in democratic principles, did not believe in the natural law principles that undergird the entire Constitution of the United States, the entire theory of representative government. They believed that they had a right to rule, they had a right to govern, and they wanted to do that primarily by establishing a major central bank where they could control the currency and they could use it to control the resources, because that is ultimately their objective. That they believe, as social Darwinists, it's important to remember, you cannot sell these people short. You cannot believe that they're just greedy. These people are terrified. They're terrified that they stand in the universe separate and apart from everything else in the universe, and they experience this intense experience of alienation from reality, and that the only way they can try to solve this is by conquering and establishing dominion over others and controlling people. It's the classic first paradigm worldview. It's the worldview that believes that the world is a chaotic place. It is a group that will tell you, oh, this was a crazed lone gunman. And the reason you can't accept that is because you can't stand the idea of a chaotic universe. You can't stand the idea of things not making any sense. You can't stand the idea of things not being connected the way it really is. And so that you will in fact be available to have someone else come and tell you what structures and what authority ought to be obeyed inside your culture. That is the first paradigm authoritarian worldview. And that's why you kept hearing all last week, oh, these conspiracy theorists can't stand the idea that just one deranged, crazy person in one moment could change the entire course of history, because that's how it really is. That's their line, okay? And that these people that are the fascists, that are the reactionaries, are the ones that go one step farther. They say, it's not that it's a totally incoherent world. It's not that the world is disintegrating into nothingness, ultimately. They, in fact, believe that there's a fundamental dialectic functioning in the universe. That there's a dialectic between the expansion and contraction of the universe that they can discern. And that you can, in fact, only lend order and rationality to the universe by knowing which side you're on. Which of the two sides are you on? Are you with the good guys or the bad guys? And what they do is they've created this concept that there is a white Caucasian super race, dare I say Ubermensch, which is the theory of Nietzsche and Hegel. And that this entire analysis that undergirds the second paradigm dialectical worldview is what engines these people, that these are fascists, and that they believe that it's absolutely essential for the Caucasian race to gain privileged access to the strategic raw materials that are needed in the world that they can use to develop into wealth, which they will then allow to trickle down to others. And if it doesn't trickle down all the way to the bottom, so much the better. Because that is what social Darwinism is all about, is that these people will basically fall out of the system and be gone. Okay? So this is the articulation of what the thesis is as to who it was that was really responsible for calling the shots to determine that the president had to be killed.